Alright, welcome to Indigenous Astronomy Sky Stories. I have given an acknowledgement already, but like I said, you are welcome to pause this lecture and give an acknowledgement to the traditional owners on the country that you find yourselves on today. I've also gone through this a bit, I think, just previously. As I said, I'm a Garo Aboriginal woman and an Indigenous Studies lecturer here at Swinburne. And up here is my research background and why we're going to be talking about narrative science and storytelling as knowledge is really because that is my background and interest area. And we're going to explore that as it relates to Indigenous astronomy, which is one of the more, I guess, ancient and timely and certainly sacred and just incredible uses of an oral tradition and of oral science. I would like to have a note on knowledge ownership. Just really want to preface this lecture by saying that these knowledges and narratives that we're looking at today, they're not mine, and they do belong to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities across Australia. And I feel very privileged to have the opportunity to share these stories with you today, but with a very clear acknowledgement that each Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person and community remains the authors of these stories. I would also like to take this time just to offer a note of appreciation. Firstly, to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples nationally, just for sharing these knowledges and keeping them generation to generation. And when we look at some of these stories, you'll see the longevity of these continue story cycles and the adaptations made to these stories as the world adapts, as the sky adapts and changes. And you'll see hopefully by the end of this lecture just how incredible these knowledges are. I will apologise for the sound in the background as we were all working from home. That is my dog coming and going, so sorry if it's a bit loud. I would also like to acknowledge the work of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander astronomers, historians, anthropologists who work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to collect these and keep these and publish these stories. The work of these authors have informed this lecture. They're cited throughout and in the bibliography. And further to that, I would like to acknowledge the work of non-Indigenous astronomers and researchers who have worked with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders and communities, especially Hamacher, Norris and others that are cited strongly throughout this lecture. They've worked with our communities for a very long time with a lot of respect, and just to showcase these knowledges and relate them at that sort of cultural interface of Western knowledge and science and Indigenous knowledge and science. So I would like to acknowledge those authors. And one final note before we actually start the lecture is on image use. So given that I'm not presenting this live, I didn't just want you to have my audio over nothing. So I've used some quite stunning photographs that illustrate some of the concepts or some of the solar things that we are discussing today, but I would like to say that I do not own any of these images and that they've been taken in accordance with the Copyright Act, where we are able to use available online images for educational purposes, but that all images belong to the cited authors in this lecture. So, who were the world's first astronomers? I think it may be interesting for some of you to know, to learn that Indigenous Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander astronomy existed long before the Babylonians, before the Greeks, before the Renaissance, and before the Enlightenment. We are the longest continuing culture in the entire world, and we have inhabited Australia for 80,000 plus years. And in our time here, we've developed a very complex relationship with the earth, where we care for it, we're sustained by it, and we protect it for future generations. And with this connection to country comes a continuing observation of and adaptation to our changing natural world. So the knowledges that we have, they're shared orally. We have an oral tradition here in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia, and these stories are shared generation to generation. So when we get to some of the longevity of these stories, when we start talking about how old some of these astronomical knowledges are, you'll see what I mean by the power of that generation to generation knowledge sharing, the ability to retain such vital information, such complicated science through and through, even if that means you've never actually experienced this for yourself, such as a solar eclipse, or a meteorite, things like that we'll talk about in a bit more detail as we go through this lecture. Today, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander astronomy is very relevant to the wider study of astronomy. And this is because our stories, our associated knowledges and sciences of some of these astronomical events go back thousands of years further than most written Western knowledge. And so we're seeing a period in time where astronomers and cultural astronomers and historians are looking to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander narratives to understand what the world and certainly the sky would have looked like at previous times. So the oral cultures of us here in Australia means that our knowledges of the sky, planets, stars, basically everything, were retained and accurately retold over hundreds and thousands of years. Now sorry about that. I should have locked him inside. So we have been and we continue to be very careful observers of the Earth here in Australia. We observed very subtle changes in the properties and positions of celestial objects, and we passed these knowledges down through generations. And this is important when we think about the rarity of some of these experiences. Of course, some observations were very common, some were, frequently occurring, but others were really rare. When we start talking about meteors, comets, eclipses, fireballs, impact events, meteorite cratering, variable stars, lunar phases, nova and supernova, these are quite rare things that are occurring, yet there are Indigenous stories of these events continually retold throughout Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia. And we're going to have a look at some of those today. Now, I'm not sure if you've all seen this map before. If you haven't, let me introduce you to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia. Each of these roughly circled colours are the traditional lands of certain Indigenous peoples here in Australia. If you look up in the Gulf of Carpentaria, so between Darwin and northern Queensland, you'll see a yellow, somewhat square-shaped, that's Garawa country, and that's where my people are from. Now, I put this here just to show how distinct, how many and how far between we are as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. If I was to superimpose a map of, say, Europe over this map of Australia, sorry about the barking, of Australia, you would pass through 7, 8, 9 different countries between where I'm from in the Northern Territory and where we are down here in Victoria today. You could get everywhere from Denmark down to Greece. So when I talk about this, what I'm really trying to get across is that there is a myth here in Australia of pan-Aboriginality. That we are all the same here in Australia, and I just want to dispel that before we start getting to these specific stories. And that's because we are so different. These are separate languages, these are separate customs, they're separate cultures with separate traditions. So when we talk of different stories today, and of course there are links as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and as Indigenous people globally, we have some core things in common: connections to country, the way we view community. All of these things are a sort of shared tenet amongst Indigenous people. But some of these stories are specific to the country that they are from and to the peoples whose stories they are. And that's because we view things in our surroundings, right? So in Garawa country, our weather systems, just give me 1 second, I'm just going to lock him in so this is a bit quieter. Sorry about that. So say in Garawa country up there in the Gulf of Carpentaria, consider that in the west you might refer to it as wet season and dry season that we have in the Northern Territory. Of course, for us, we see a lot more seasons than those two that are typically applied in the west. But now consider down here in Victoria the weather systems that you might have, the food availabilities that you might have, the medicine, even the earth, even the structures of the earth, right? What your environment is like. So this is important because the knowledges that you take from your environment and the knowledges that you take from the sky are dependent, because what you need is dependent on country, and there is that interconnection, very strong interconnection between person, community and country. So when we start looking at these stories, you'll see how strongly they are tied to the specific country that you're on, to the availability of certain foods and medicines in those areas, and to the specific peoples in those countries. And I will preference, because I know a lot of you probably haven't taken any of our Indigenous Studies units or haven't really learnt about Indigenous knowledges before. So when I say country, every one of these coloured circles are countries, right? We refer to as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander countries, and this is specific denoted land that belongs to a traditional owner group. So just be aware of that as we go through. Now let's talk about narrative science, because that is, well, my background, specifically storytelling as knowledge transfer. So for us Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, storytelling is the way we transmit knowledges. It's the way we educate our communities, and not just our youth and not just our kids, but it is the way we learn and engage with each other and with the world. And story serves many purposes. Within our stories, there's life lessons, rules for living, as well as detailed understandings of our waterways, our landscapes, seascapes, and the world above us. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have a very strong connection to the country, but also to the sky, right? We view the sky as mirroring the earth. So the sky for us is essentially a map for the earth. And you'll see this in some of the sky stories that we discussed today, that there is this deep holistic connection to everything. And what I really want to get across is that our stories are more than just beautiful tales of custom, law, and behaviour, and they are that, of course. But when we dig deeper, we can see that these narratives are used to describe the scientific world, to understand the scientific world, and to engage with it. So we are more than just stories and symbolism. We are extensive knowledges and understandings of both the world here on the ground and the world above. Indigenous dreaming stories, cultural stories, and songs document deep knowledges of and explanation of everything from eclipses to planets, celestial bodies, to reasons why the tide comes in and recedes. And we use these sky knowledges to navigate, to keep time, to understand and engage with seasons, to predict movements of water, all of these things that govern how you live and how you know that resources are going to be available to you, how you know that you're going to have enough or be prepared for weather systems. All of this knowledge came from the sky. And we document these not only through story and song and art and artifacts, but even in stone. And we're going to look at that a little bit later in the lecture. So let's talk navigation and astronomy. Now, I'm not sure if any of you have ever seen a picture like this before, but this is a songline or a series of songlines. It is the interconnecting songlines that track across Australia. So a songline or a dreaming track is essentially a musical narrative map, and it informs navigations. So we're going to talk about that in a bit more detail. So I've popped a quote in here. It says, "Songlines are epic creation songs, passed to present generations by a line of singers, continuous since the dream time. These songs or song cycles have various names according to which language group they belong to, and tell the story of the creation of the land, provide maps for the country, and hand down law as decreed by the creation heroes of the dream time. Some songlines describe a path crossing the entire Australian continent." And we're going to look at one of those such stories today. So our songlines are navigational songs, but they're complex. They link back to our dreaming. You might have heard them referred to before as strings or dreaming tracks. And they run across Australia, and they help us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people travel vast distances accurately and safely, for everything from trade or cultural practices, or for the moving around for seasonal availabilities of housing, food, medicine, etc. Some of our songlines are only a few kilometres long. Others are hundreds of kilometres and inland across several deserts with very little water supplies, and we're going to look at that one in a bit more detail today. Our songlines are linked to Indigenous law, and some routes can only be taken in some directions. Now, I'm sure all of you will have heard about Aboriginal people trying to stop people climbing Uluru, right, in Central Australia. And that's because the Anargut mob of Central Australia have songlines associated with Uluru. And their law indicates that the only legal climbing direction from Uluru is down. And so this is why mob don't climb and why we request that you don't climb either. Okay, this is the Ualee songline between Queensland and New South Wales. Next to it, you'll see that the sky is mirrored in the ground, right? The sky, to the left-hand image, is the Scorpius star cluster. So while our songlines held directions, land and sky directional indicators, as well as locations of key landmarks that would provide food and water sources on our walk. So you can see this linkage between the sky and the stars and land. I've got another quote here that I was going to include, and it's by Gamage in 2011, and it says, "A songline or storyline is the path or corridor along which a creator ancestor moved to bring country into being. It also the way of the ancestor's totem, the geographical expression of their songs, dances and paintings animating its country, an ecological proof of the unity of things." And I think that is a really beautiful way to describe a songline. Okay, another quote here from DS in Norris. It says, "The dreaming track in the sky, planets making the pathway, travelling routes, a pathway, you could call it like a highway. Travelling pathway joins to all different areas, to base place, to camping place, to ceremony place, where the trade routes come in, all this sort of things. The dreaming track in the sky, the planets come straight across, walking trail becomes a pad, then becomes a wagon road, two-wheel tracks, then become a highway."